in to this particular chapter, I really was kind of sad because I have so enjoyed studying the Constitution laid out in Torah. It is my heart and soul. And I was almost teary-eyed, kind of we're going away from it. We're no longer focusing on the Constitution that really is the life source of our existence. So what we're going to be doing now is, as we transition with this chapter, we're going to be going into more of the historical and validity issues, which are very important, but they're just not the same as those constitutional values that really imbibe you with life. Now, as I work through this section the last couple days, I really think that even though we're only doing about 23 pages, there is so much information in here that I really want to take it a little bit slow. So we may end up dividing tonight's lesson into 2 weeks, simply because there is so much here to cover, and I really don't want to leave anything out. And I think as we get through it, if you haven't read the material, I think you'll see why as we go through it. For those of you that have read the material, I think you already know what I'm talking about. So the first thing that we're going to look at tonight is the harmony of both the Sinai and Deuteronomic law code, both of those constitutions, as well as the harmony of doctrine that you find within those documents. And really not just those documents, it really goes back to the patriarchal covenants, because we find that those covenants are sewn in, if you will. If you look at a garment, they're sewn into the Mosaic code, and they are totally encompassed by it. They are absorbed by it, so that the latter document absorbs all the patriarchal covenants, all the stipulations, all the regulations, and all the blessings. They're all within that later covenant. So what I want to start with, and I really kind of am just setting a precedent here, because we're going to come back to this as we discuss some of the more chronological issues and more historical issues later on. I really wanted to lay this foundation of Yahovah, of the God of Israel, as a righteous judge. The popular approach to God nowadays is to approach him as though he is this good guy who's on your side. He's all positive, he's all good, and this good guy really never would do anything that is not nice. You know, he's we almost make God into this popular guy at school, you know. He's only going to say and do good things. But the reality is that in Scripture, God is also a God of judgment. And he judges between the righteous and the wicked. He separates the two, so that the righteous, he tries to make their way prosperous, while the wicked, he tries to either put obstacles in front of them, or he seeks to destroy their way, so that they won't oppress, and so that they will not put others into captivity, and that they will not be dishonest with them. So we find this concept in Scripture, and guys, I am beginning, just so you are all with me, so that we're all on the same page. We are beginning on page 281, and we find that this role of God as judge who seeks to alleviate the oppression of the disadvantaged. You find that the overall law brings all of these statutes into one frame of mind, into one one way of life, and into one method of constitution to preserve life, family, community, and unity within the land of Israel. So just a quick review over what we've studied the last 3 chapters. We really have been looking at this since, I think it was about November. So we've looked at it pretty in depth. We find that the Torah, when it is followed, it abolishes slavery, that it relieves oppression. The oppression of debt every 7 years is relieved. It abolished poverty by giving every single male citizen within the land of Israel a tax-free land on which to live and raise his family. He owed no debt to the state by he was free to live on his land. You also find that the Constitution defined taxation so that you couldn't just arbitrarily raise income taxes and people never knew what to plan for 3, 4, 5, 15 years down the line. You also find that it limited government. It limited the lands government could own. And if government has very limited land resources, there's really limits placed on the responsibilities that government can assume and the role that it can play within society. You find that the Constitution defines statutes for judgment, both for the court system as well as for how Israel's legislature would work. You find that it allowed for a self-representative republic. Now, one thing that's very interesting, and one thing that we learn throughout history about these democracies, a republic where the people are represented in every aspect of government. There's something very odd that we learn about these throughout history. And that is, while these self-defining and very self-representative systems of government are very willing to defend themselves, and if there is another nation that is just grossly oppressing human rights, they may intervene and take some action. But democracies do not attack each other. They recognize the right of another society, of another democracy, to have its own representative government. So this is why Europe, granted post-World War II, and even within some of the societies that you had growing out of that, they really did not attack one another. And, you know, it's why you have friendly relationships among those societies, because there is a foundation. There is a understanding and a philosophy that makes you kindred in your approach to life, and it unifies you. Even if you have differences in how you apply it, you still recognize that fundamental right. Whereas in oppressive regimes, whether it is a communist regime, whether it's a fascist, or whether it is Sharia, you find that those spark enormous amounts of tension, social tension, because there is not the freedom from oppression within the society, and it calls out for some sort of judgment. And we learn from history that God often sends one nation against another nation as a form of judgment. The other thing that we have found over the last few months is that God recognized that in order to follow his law, you had to have a land that was free to you to be able to do it. So you couldn't just, you know, go into a place that is Sharia and governed by statutes and judgments that are totally alien to Torah and expect to have liberties such as women's rights recognized. That's just not going to happen. You're not going to have the rights of child recognized in an oppressive society. So he gave Israel their own land so that they could grow. He knew that in a communist Russia, there would be oppression and they could not follow Torah. In a place like Iran, you could not follow it because those regimes would be totally oppressive. So again, he set about to give them a land to be able to allow that freedom. But you also find that this idea that even though Israel anciently had this incredible freedom, Israel despised it. She never really appreciated it. She took it for granted. And she wanted to be just like all the nations of the earth. And I think this is so similar to America today. We have had no nation on earth has had the amount of liberty, freedom, and social justice at the same time that the United States has. It is incredible. You look at what we have been able to achieve scientifically, medically, in every way. We have been able to do what no other nation has done in the last 2,500 years. But yet we also find that as we progress and as we depart from a constitution, here is America not valuing her freedoms, not valuing her way that her social government is structured. And now America, like ancient Israel, is wanting to become like all the nations of the earth. So you find this process is really repetitive. So there's a need for a lot of education. But you also find within both the Sinai covenant and the Deuteronomy covenant, you find this harmony of doctrine, this harmony of social justice that, again, America has really been founded on, and we can see why it has been so beneficial. There were changes between the Sinai covenant and the Deuteronomy covenant. They were not exactly the same. God used the Deuteronomic covenant to strengthen the Sinai covenant by adding provisions, by adding stipulations to ensure social justice and to prevent oppression. One of these that I'd like to look at was the stipulation on slavery. Originally, Hebrew slavery, when you set your slave free, when you released him at the end of 7 years, in Exodus 21 verse 2, you simply released that slave. There was no obligation. After 40 years of God dealing with Israel and him seeing that Israel had no desire to adhere to the law, that Israel complained about every statute, about everything God was giving them, he understood Israel's propensity to oppress their fellow brothers, something that was brought home at the end of the monarchy under Zedekiah, when Jeremiah went to great lengths to encourage the elders and the leaders of the people to release their Hebrew slaves, and they reneged on the deal. So there was a long-standing history of oppression within Israel, something that I think a lot of us here in America maybe cannot relate to, simply because we have a whole lot more control over our lives than what they did in ancient times. But for those that, you know, when you live mouth to mouth, when you live from paycheck to paycheck, you know, when you're one illness away from being kicked out of your home, you can definitely relate to that. So it is something that's people here in America can relate to, I think, just not to the same extent of what it was anciently. You also have the case of usury, where, you know, anciently usury was something that worked a little bit different than commercial interest does today. In ancient times, usury would take as collateral your land, your possessions. If you defaulted, you were kicked off your land, your clothing, your housewares, everything that you own could be claimed as collateral to satisfy your debt. The other thing that you had was that your loan could be called at any point in time. So if your lender gets into a financial crisis, he can go demand of you your loan, and you have to pay him on the spot, whether, you know, even though if it had been, say, a 5, 6, 7 year loan, that person could call it at any time. Israel's law forbid all of those types of usury within its country, seeking to protect its fellow citizens. So that was a provision, an economic provision that strengthened the land. You also have the added provision that when the slave was set free, that the slave was supposed to be set free with startup capital to begin his new life. And this was the added provision with Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 5:12-14 says that you're supposed to give him of your flocks, of your wine, and of your grain. So you're supposed to give him seed capital to begin his life again when he goes back to his land. You also find that what this did not do, what this statute did not do, was increase taxation on the wealthy. Yes, you helped that person who had helped you and who had served you faithfully for those 6 years. Yes, you helped him get a a fresh start, but that was a very small percentage of what you actually owed, and you did this as a courtesy and as a benefit to that person for their years of service, of indentured servitude. You also find the injunctions within Deuteronomy where it says this day, you know, obey the law this day, as superseding the Sinai covenant. And it also, Deuteronomy strengthened its own legal standing, its own constitutional standing, by forbidding constitutional amendments, something that is kind of alien to American society. But we have to remember, and as we get into this study today, I think we're going to see why it was so important, where you had constitutional, it forbid constitutional amendments because the law was perfect, it was complete. It may not have addressed every single issue, but the precepts that were established did address every single issues. So you find that the Constitution protected the poor. It fostered national solidarity. It prolonged the days of your life by teaching you foods that were healthy and foods that were unhealthy, by teaching you cleanliness, and by preventing disease. You also find that in this, you don't find any conflict between Deuteronomy and between Moab. You don't find any conflict of philosophical doctrine. It upholds the entire thing. So when we start with the Abrahamic covenant, and even going back to Noah, when we start with the Noahic covenant and we go through the three Abrahamic covenants, when you go through the Jacobic covenants, when you go down to Israel, they all reiterate the same thing. They all uphold one another, and that is the harmony that is established within it. You also find that, and then let's just look at a couple of these here before we move on. The statute that prohibits amendments is going to be Deuteronomy 4:40. It says, "You shall keep therefore these statutes and commandments which I command you this day, that it may go well with you and your children after you, that you may prolong your days on the earth, which Yahweh your God gives you forever." I'm sorry, that was not the constitutional amendment. That was the idea that the Torah's constitution is actually capable of prolonging your days and giving you prosperity on the land in every way, whether it's economically, whether it's family relationships, whether it is national security. All the things that we deal with as a society are established within that Torah constitution. And as we're going to see, all of these governmental ideas, all of these ideas of relationships between your fellow man transcend a relationship with God. And it also informs and defines the spiritual relationship that we have with our Creator and that we maintain between our fellow men. You also find in Deuteronomy 10:12 the idea that the Deuteronomy covenant that was commanded this day. Deuteronomy is in many ways kind of like Moses's last will and testament in many ways, because he takes all of the teachings that God had given to him and he gives it to them in a document that he writes in front of the Levites all in one day, and he hands that to Israel. And you find that it is supposed to make them wealthy, strong, a nation full of wisdom. And here we come to the regulation forbidding constitutional amendments, and that is Deuteronomy 4:2, where it says, "You shall not add to the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish anything from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, which I commanded you." And it's reiterated again in Deuteronomy 12:32. So there's the idea that the law is complete, is capable of giving you long life. I mean, that is something that the United States Constitution cannot claim. The United States Constitution can empower you with liberty, with national security, and with social harmony, but it cannot prolong the days of your life, and it cannot inform on the relationships that you have within your family and within your local communities. While you can extrapolate some of its principles, the United States Constitution does break down on local levels as far as how you're going to apply it. We're going to see today that the Torah Constitution does not break down, and that the spiritual values that are imbibed in it are really something that can benefit us well into the future. So coming back now to the idea that God rewards righteousness and that he punishes iniquity, that if you rebel against him, he's going to hold you accountable. We find the idea in Torah, and I am now on page 284 if you guys are following along, that this idea of family heritage, where there is such an importance of children within the Tanakh. I mean, children are just seen as such an incredible gift. They are your greatest asset and your greatest investment. You find that children preserved in ancient times, not just in Israel, but in other nations, they preserved a memory of their forefathers by living on their land. Often the name of that father was associated with their children. So when those children were alive, they kept his name and his remembrance alive. By the time Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple, 22 generations of families had lived on Israel's land and provided a testament to their forefathers. So you are so well connected to your family and this incredibly rich heritage that you had. You knew who you were, you knew where you came from, and you knew what you stood for. So it wasn't where you just moved away and you had no connection to your family. It was something that was very rich and very meaningful. You also find this idea that when men just are horribly oppressive, when they totally disregard the law and they blaspheme Yahweh in what they do as far as their oppressive acts, that God actually seeks to destroy their entire house, with them, their children, just blot their name out and give them, it's called giving them no remembrance in the congregation. You find that God did this with Ahab. He did this with Jeroboam and Baasha, who were all kings of Ephraim, the northern kingdom. You find that there's this concept that if you have children that exist 4 generations, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations down the line, that it attests to your righteousness. So your children testify to the fact that you did a great job in raising them. You instilled them with the right values. You instilled them with the right understanding of how life works. You also find that people like Job, righteous people, are promised to have children for generations to come. You have the midwives of Pharaoh who are promised sure houses. Here are women being given covenants by God, being promised that their seed will never fail. They will always have children within Israel, represented within Israel's congregation. The same promise is made to David and Levi. We also find that the penalties of the law were also enforced, where it often limited the ability to produce seed. So that is a consequence and a curse of Israel's law, but it's mitigated and it is absolved by always coming back to that covenant and that constitution. So at this point, I'm going to switch kind of topics, and I really want to get into tonight the idea of Israel's spiritual law. We've been focusing strictly on covenant and constitution, but we have really not touched on what that means as far as a relationship with God. And does it just stop in the physical? You know, today there's this controversy between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. So I want to look at how the Torah approaches this and how YHWH views this. So what I want to do is look at some allegations, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, there was so much in this part because I actually go through and I take notes on what I've written. It's almost as though I'm studying it again for not for the first time, because I'm very familiar with it, but when all the research and what is written, I've really found that I could not express it in a teaching better than what it was written. So I am going to do quite a bit of reading tonight of what I have written, just because I think it conveys it in a method that I don't think I can accurately recreate or reconvey. So I'll tell you what page we're on as we go along. So I'm going to be on page 286 right now. But you find in modern theology this allegation that the Torah is not inferior, but that it is incapable of meeting humanity's spiritual needs. There are allegations that not only can man not meet the physical obligations of the law, but man cannot meet the spiritual obligations. In other words, there is this mentality that humanity was never capable of having the spiritual wherewithal to obey the law. So I want to look at some of these. And I'm going to read on page 286. You know, in effect, this is what this doctrine states. It says, people believe that Yahweh gave humanity a law, a way of life that does indeed work, but he knew it was beyond humanity's ability to observe it. One theologian states, I am not trying to wander back into the legalistic rules of the Old Testament. God knew we could never keep those to begin with. We needed the law so that we could see our sin. So the whole purpose of this Constitution was not to establish a righteous society that imbued human rights, that defined human rights, that established standards for social justice. You know, people just really look over those aspects of the law and they want to focus on the fact that it is deficient spiritually, and that is something spiritually which we cannot keep. And this is honestly something that is very, very close to ancient Israel's allegation. You know, in the first chapter of the book, I brought up how Micah 6:2 and Ezekiel 18:25 talk about how ancient Israel alleged that Yahovah and his way of life were unfair. It was something that they could not do and they could not keep. So this allegation is some almost 3,000 years old, and the discussion is still going on today. So I would like to put to rest some of those arguments and like to put to rest some of those ideas so that we can see the spiritual value within Yahovah's law. You know, I do compare this line of thinking with the spiritual inferiority of the law to a parent giving a mentally delayed child a course in school that is either well beyond his years or above his capability. And then when that child is incapable, physically, mentally, whatever, incapable of meeting the demands of that coursework, the parent then punishes the child. That is not a righteous parent if they would do that. But yet it is that same type of setup, that same type of situation that is fostered on the God of the Old Testament. He is viewed as harsh, as unmerciful, as giving us a law just to prove us incapable of keeping it, to prove us incapable of doing anything of our own merits. So I want to challenge that, because we're going to find that the text states something entirely different. So where is the relationship and the compatibility between physical and spiritual law? This ties into the idea that physical actions are outside of the realm of spiritual, and spiritual realm is outside of the physical. It's almost as though never do the twain meet. But do they? So I'm going to challenge that. So yes, we have lots of challenges tonight. And I might pause quite a bit through this because I really don't want to miss any of this. And I am actually going straight out of the book tonight because I think this topic is so important. One of the logical flaws of modern theology is that we associate righteousness with perfection. So we think that in order for someone to be righteous, they must be perfect. There is the command in Torah where Yahweh says, be you tanim, which is perfect in every sense of the way. It's wholly perfect, even as I am perfect. So people will extrapolate that to imply that if we do not keep the Torah in every sense of the word, whether we violate it by thought or by action, if we've sinned against one, we've sinned against all. So is that a correct interpretation? Is that a correct understanding of what the Torah is trying to convey? And I want to give you some examples, some very concrete examples. We find that many people in Torah sinned. They committed a sin in one respect or the other, but they are still considered righteousness. So what we find is that in Torah and in the Tanakh, righteousness is not equated with perfection. Rather, righteousness is equated to a commitment to uphold the way of Yahweh. And if you sin against it, you acknowledge your sin, you teshuvah, you repent, and you recommit to that way. The example of David's life is what Torah means by following it. So let's look at some examples. We have Noah. Noah is counted as righteous in Genesis 7:1. Abraham, who is mentioned as a prophet, is considered a righteous man, even though he deceived Pharaoh. He was dishonest with Pharaoh, and he was dishonest with Abimelech in Genesis 12:11 through 20. And in Genesis 20, he's still considered a righteous man. You have Moses. He killed an Egyptian. And he is, let me see, and he also disobeyed God's instruction in striking the rock instead of speaking to it. But yet he is still considered righteous, even being called a man of God at the end of his life in Deuteronomy 33, verse 1. King David committed murder. Well, first he committed adultery, then he committed murder to cover up the adultery. But he's still considered a righteous king, a righteous person, because he repented. Now his sin is forever remembered. That is not erased, and the consequence of that sin is not erased, but he is remembered as a righteous person. Hold on, I'm seeing little kids in the background running around. You also have, and not only is David remembered as a righteous king, his life is used as a standard of righteousness for all the other kings that come after him. So God does forgive his sin, even though the consequence is there. You will also find that Asa is said to have walked before Yahweh with a perfect heart until the end of his life when he sinned against Yahweh, but he's still remembered for his righteousness. And then we come to one of my favorite portions of Torah. And I'm getting into this a little bit tonight, but I'm going to give y'all, I guess, a little teaser in that in volume 2, when we come back to this, I imagine it will probably be December before we're actually there. But we come to the story of Job. And I just want to tell you guys, there are hidden jewels in the book of Job that we really just kind of gloss over. We read it without the historical context, and we miss so much. So let's approach Job historically and in context. And the most important thing that you can know about Job is that his 3 friends did not say what is right in Yahweh's sight, and that Job and Elihu did say what was right in Yahweh's sight. And as we go through this, you're going to see why. So the modern allegations that the law is incapable of meeting humanity's needs, the idea that the law cannot meet humanity's spiritual needs, come from this idea that humanity can never be right or find favor or grace or be clean in Yahweh's sight. There's this idea that man, in and of his own right, can never be right with God. He can never be atoned for for who he is and for that original sin in Eden. So is this a correct understanding? Is this a doctrine that is supported within Torah? You find within the book of Job, you find that Job and his three friends, and let me just say that the most outspoken person against Job is Elihu. So who is Elihu? Elihu was Esau's son. He was an Edomite. Joab himself is an Edomite. He was one of the rulers, the dukes of Edom. He's mentioned, I believe it is in Genesis 12 as Jobab. That's the way his name appears. But this happens very, very early in history. You know, this is probably before Israel goes into Egypt, or right when they go into Egypt. It's right at that time period. And you find that there is some interaction with Israel because Elihu, there is indication that he was an Israelite when he came and he gave Job counsel. But you find that there are some very important statements that reveal Edomite theology and Edomite Canaanite theology that opposes the Torah. So first of all, look at Job 42, verse 7, and I am on page 287 if you guys are following along. It says, and so it was that after YHWH had spoken these words to Job, Yahweh said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and your two friends. This would have been Zophar and Bildad. He says, for they have not spoken of me that which is right, as has my servant Job. So we have a contrast. Job has spoken what is right. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have not. So what was it? This leads to the next question. And anytime you guys see this, always ask questions. What was it that they said that was not right in YHWH's eyes? Where did their words and their counsel depart? You find that let's look at some of the fundamental ideas of this pagan Edomite Canaanite theology. In Job 15:15, Eliphaz says, behold, he puts no trust in his saints. Yes, the heavens are not clean in his sight. Where have we heard this before? Then again, you find in Job 25, verses 4 through 6, this is going to be Bildad speaking. He says, how then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even the moon, and it shines not. Yes, the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man that is a worm, and the son of man, which is a worm. So you find this idea that humanity can never be clean in the eyes of God. But this is what Job replies to them. This is Job's response. He says, my righteousness I will hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. That is Job 27, verse 6. So you have two opposite parts of the spectrum. Job maintains that humanity can be righteous. Job even maintains that even though he's going through all these trials and tribulations, he is still righteous, and he will maintain his righteousness before God and before his friends that have come to give him advice. God upholds Job's words, and he condemns Eliphaz's words. So that right there is a very strong example of a contradiction in modern theology. The other thing that this idea of the law's inferior spiritual nature, it falls to the logical error of generalities. And this generality views one sin as committing all the sins. So if you sin against YHWH, say by committing theft, it's the same thing as committing murder. If you've broken one law, you've broken them all. So is this a correct interpretation or a correct understanding? If you look in the law, which we have been looking at for the last couple months, there are graduated penalties. There's one type of penalty for theft, for negligence, for unintentional manslaughter, but there are completely different penalties for adultery, intentional negligence, and intentional murder. So they're graduated. They are not one and the same, and they are not all in the same. You know, those types of governments that view all crime equal tend to be very totalitarian. They tend to be very oppressive, where any crime that is committed is a crime against the state, and it has the most horrific retributions. This is not Torah, and this is not the liberty that Torah establishes. Torah establishes this incredible amount of freedom where it is different from sin to sin, and they are not all lumped into that generic category. You also find this idea that, coming back to the idea that humanity can be righteous, is that Abraham, when God tells him he's going to go destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and we know from the story of Lot just how wicked Sodom and Gomorrah were, Abraham thought that even though they were wicked, there was still a possibility of 50 righteous people existing within them. But notice that Abraham thinks that they're righteous people. So righteous people do exist, and you do not have to be perfect in every way to be righteous, or to have life, or to have anything that Yahovah offers, which we will see. Isaiah 1:21 states that there were righteous people at one time living in Jerusalem. So we find this idea that righteousness can exist, and that humanity can be righteous, good, and he can find favor in Yahovah's eyes. So this comes now, we're going to get more and more into the spiritual nature of the law now, and we just let you guys know, we may go over a little bit tonight, so be prepared. We might go 10 to 15 minutes over, because I don't want to divide this part in two, because it is all part of the same concept. But we are going to divide the chapter at some point, but just not this part of the spiritual nature of the law. So I am going to basically read some excerpts from the book, because I cannot adequately restate it. So I'm on to page 298 if you guys want to follow along. Modern theology views spiritual realms separately from the physical world. The adherents of the law's insufficient spiritual nature see the law as works or deeds that humans perform on the physical level only, and it has no bearing on a person's spiritual well-being. This concept was completely alien to Yahovah's teaching, because the law provided both spiritual guidance and the understanding to apply it in the physical world. The natural laws that provided justice and righteousness and procured health were the same natural laws that provided spiritual enlightenment and relationship with God. Physical laws illuminated spiritual truths. So, there really is no separation. Today we really want to separate and divide, but that is to our own hurt. It is to our own detriment, because we lose out. We lose out on the connection between the two. We lose out on the harmony and the ability to live in completeness. I'm drying out a little bit tonight because I have a heater at my feet, because it is cold for those of us here in the South. I think we're a little bit below 30 tonight. So have the heater roaring, and I'm drinking my water because it does dry you out. Continuing on, Yahweh tells Israel right before they're about to enter the promised land. This is in Deuteronomy 8 verse 3. He tells them that he has given to them the bread of life, that his word is the bread of life. And let's look at this. This is Deuteronomy 8:3. He says, Moses tells Israel, Yahweh humbled you and suffered you to hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, neither did you had your fathers known, that he may make you know that man does not live by bread only, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahovah. Well, okay. So this is, say, 1500 BCE. Israel's about to enter the land. What was the word of life? What was the bread of life that God had spoken to Israel? Well, at Mount Sinai, what he had directly spoken with his own voice were the 10 categories, the 10 commandments. He had also given the law. What we don't know if that was spoken or not. Probably not. It was probably just written. But we have the patriarchal covenants. The patriarchal covenants and the law are the only record that we have of any bread of life that God had given to Israel. So we find that those are the definition, and it is the foundation for the bread of life that Jehovah gave to the Israelites. But notice this idea that this word of Jehovah is capable of sustaining life. You find that in Ezekiel 33:15, the prophet goes so far as to define the statutes of Jehovah's laws, the things like refraining from pork, circumcision, becoming in a clean state. All of these would have been statutes. He states that these are statutes of life. They are able of procuring life and of sustaining life, and in making your life last well beyond your present generation and well beyond its time, because your society, again, this is beyond one person, as a friend of mine would say, it is a corporate endeavor. It is based on the entire society. Now you find that the Sabbath, by observing Shabbat, was the sign that you were in compliance with the entire covenant. Exodus 31 verses 16 establishes not only the weekly Shabbat, but also the Jubilees as the sign that the nation of Israel was in compliance with the covenant. And this is the reason why you see Jeremiah and Zedekiah's day trying to rally the troops, trying to rally the nation, and commit them to allowing their Hebrew servants, indentured servants, to go free, because that was a sign of compliance. So Jeremiah understood the importance of recovenanting and of giving God some tangible sign that it was more than lip service. And he tried to do it. The people failed, and that is why they went into captivity. You find that the Sabbath, though, has key spiritual understanding. The Sabbath is key to understanding the statutes, the laws, and the ability to live out what is promised in the physical world, so that it is even something more. Let me come right here. I have a couple of things marked. I just wanted to make sure I did not miss. You find this concept that the overall precept governing the Sabbath institution is the idea of freedom from oppression and freedom from the house of bondage. By physically observing the statute in the covenant, Yahweh would know that Israel was adhering to his covenant, and likewise, Israel would know that she would enjoy freedom from oppression. So if your nation is observing the Shabbat, if they are observing the Jubilees, you can rest assured that your nation will not face oppression by a foreign entity. That is a promise within Torah. But even more importantly, the Sabbath taught Israel that the spiritual precept and philosophy that the people should not oppress their fellow countrymen. So by observing the Shabbat, giving your workers a day off, it showed that you were committed to not oppressing your fellow man. And seeking to refrain from oppression is a foundation of having a relationship with God. If you are going to seek to control and oppress other people, then God is not really apt to hear your prayers. He's not apt to have a relationship with you, because it violates that fundamental precept within the law. And you're just not developing the character of a person that he desires a relationship with. However, even if you fall into the category of oppression, God still allows you to turn from your ways at any point in time and come back to him and restore a relationship, or start a new one in a beginning. You find King Solomon, who understood the law and who had 2 covenants with Jehovah. He writes in Proverbs 12:28, he says, "In the way of righteousness there is life, and in the pathway, the direct of it, there is no death." So you have this concept that kind of flies in the face of ancient Israel's charges. It flies in the face of modern theological charges that the law is insufficient. it says that if the law defines righteousness, if it is a way, a pathway of life, if you follow it, there is no death in it. Isaiah talks about when Israel is restored, our days will be as the trees. And, trees live thousands of years. It gets to the point where it becomes eternal, where there is no death, because death itself is weeded out of society generation after generation as health is restored one generation at a time. David tells us in Psalms 19, verse 7, that the law is perfect. If it's perfect, it's going to be perfect in every way, both physically and spiritually. Okay, getting text from my daughter tonight. You also find that the law was based on precepts. Precepts which are very close in some regards to ideas that have developed within Christianity. One of these being the Golden Rule, which is founded on Torah. Most of people associate the Golden Rule primarily as a Christian teaching and a Christian doctrine. That Christian teaching and Christian doctrine is grounded and arises from the Torah. So let's look at a couple of these. The law accepts, the law understands that physical stress, mental stress, and anguish often shorten your life, while peace and harmony lengthen your days. So God sought to relieve oppression in every way. He sought to promote social justice in every way. So in Leviticus 19, 17 through 18, Jehovah says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall rebuke your neighbor and not suffer your sin upon him. You shall not avenge nor bear a grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So God gives us some very practical reason, understanding in how we should love our neighbor. It's not just a nebulous, throw it out there at the wind, loving your neighbor. It's practical. If your neighbor sins, and this would be a sin against the law, you're supposed to correct him. This is not how most of us think of loving our neighbor. And most of our neighbors today would not think of correction as something that was loving in any regard. Most people who are corrected go off in a huff and they puff and they think that you're being critical or you're being self-righteous or all this other list of grievances that they have against personal correction. But according to Torah, if you see someone that is having an affair, or someone who is putting themselves in a situation to have an affair, or someone who is coveting an item, and they talk about, that person over there, they have something I really want, and it's not fair that they have all of this and I don't have something, maybe he could live without it. Those types of conversations are opportunities to offer some correction before that sin takes the next step and becomes an action, and where it's something more than just a thought. But also notice too, something that is a gift, a precept that we find in this law. God does not tell us to love our brother greater than ourselves, and Yahweh does not tell us to love our brother less than ourselves. Rather, it is to be equal. It is equality. So God does not put one above the other. So when you are dealing with your fellow man, whether it's your children or whether it's co-workers or family members, that it is equality. You don't put them above yourself. You don't put them below yourself, but you deal with them on an equal and level playing field, not overstepping the rights of any, but looking at them, because often rights compete, so especially in family relationships. So you have to look at them equally and judge and discern between them on equal grounds. But also notice that the command for Israel to love her neighbor, that's something that's spiritual. That's of the heart. That is not something, loving your neighbor is not a physical action that you can do. It's not as though you can go out and put a sign in your front yard that says, hey, I love the guy next door. That's not what it's talking about. Loving your neighbor is something, it's a feeling, it's emotion, it's a desire and a state of mind, an attitude that you have within your heart and mind. So again, this is a spiritual issue. To love your neighbor involve thoughts, feelings, desires, and intentions of the heart. The Creator desired his people to train and discipline themselves to refrain from hatred and other negative desires that were counterproductive to his eternal way of life. He grounded his spiritual truth in physical commands. So notice the spiritual truth of loving your neighbor is grounded in the physical command of rebuking your neighbor when he sins. So you see that the two go hand in hand. They are not separated. So you find that the spiritual truths the spiritual precepts should always manifest itself into the physical world. Now, service of the heart is the next section that we're going to look at. And again, I'm on page 290 if you guys are following along. And I see that there are some comments up here. I think I'll just catch them at the very end because I want to get through this material because we are already on the 1 hour mark. So we'll continue on. We have about 4 more pages, so we might go over by a good 15 minutes tonight. So with the service of the heart, God made us in his likeness and his image. And as a loving creator, he understood who we are. He understood our needs, our desires, both physical, emotional, and spiritual. So this is why he addressed so much of his law to his people, exhorting them to bring their whole heart and mind into order with his way of life. So it is not just something that you do. It is something that you embrace wholeheartedly, and you train your desires and your emotions. Now, Betty asked a question, which I am going to catch here real quick. Who is your neighbor? That is a very good question. Let's start with the context of ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, it would have been your fellow citizen, your fellow Israelite. It would even include the Ger that had converted and lived among you. It never included your enemies. Your enemies were out to destroy you. Your enemies were out to seek your harm. Those you were not commanded to love. And in fact, you have a lot of Psalms by David which talk about destroying his enemies or hating his enemies or things such as that. You do not find that with the idea of fellow citizenship. And in ancient Israel, the idea of being a neighbor was usually a fellow citizen, a fellow countryman. So I would say that even today, your neighbor is, very loosely speaking, your fellow countryman. And I say that broadly because even in our society today, our fellow countrymen don't always have the same constitutional values and standards and understanding of human rights that we do based on Torah. So I don't know if that helps narrow it down at all, but very loosely, I would say that it is your fellow countryman that would apply in a modern context, or outside of your fellow countrymen, fellow Torah observant people who have the kindred spirit of the Torah that unites them together. So going on, and thank you so much for that, Stephen. I appreciate that. And that might be something that we do in the future. All right, I'm going to come back to that comment in a minute because I do want to get through this material because for me, this is what makes Torah real. What good does it do if it isn't personal, if it isn't something that benefits us in our lives and makes our quality of life better and gives us a better relationship with God? So we find that the spiritual law is the physical law, the constitutional law that is defined at a government level is something that becomes very personal. Deuteronomy 26, verse 16, Yahweh says, "This day Yahweh your God has commanded you to do all these statutes and judgments. You shall therefore keep them and do them with all your heart and soul." All your heart and soul is something that is spiritual. It is something that is within you. It's not something that you can outwardly desire. It comes from within you, your attitude, your frame of mind. And believe it or not, that frame of mind can be trained. The actions, the attitude, the desires can all be trained. It may take time, but it can be done. And Steve says, Hebrew word for neighbor is ra'ah, which means one pastured in the same flock by the same shepherd. That is very, very sweet, Stephen. That's a very, very good, very, very good point. And that's why I said, if it is within the context of today, if you have an affinity of religious beliefs, an affinity of values, those unite you because those values shepherd you. And ultimately, we are looking to the God of Israel as the source of light and inspiration. Let's also look at Deuteronomy 10, 12 through 16. And let's look at this one because this is another spiritual precept that is given within the laws. The law, people want to accuse the law of being do's and don'ts, of being, eat this, don't eat that, and it's just all something that's physical. It really isn't. Look at what Moses tells the children of Israel. And again, this is Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 16. And now, Israel, what does Yahweh require of you but to fear Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, to keep the commandment of Yahweh and his statutes, which I command you this day for your good. Behold, the heaven of heavens is Yahweh your God's, and the earth also, and all that is within. Only Yahweh had delight in your fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all people, as it is this day. Circumcise, listen to this now. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. So this idea of circumcision, even though it is a physical command that males are physically circumcised, it is applied spiritually within the law, because you physically circumcise, you cut away that part of the foreskin that is unhealthy, that harbors disease, that harbors infection and bacteria. You cut that away so that you do not endanger yourself and you do not endanger your partner. The same thing with the spiritual aspects of the law. You circumcise, you cut away those desires, those attitudes, those wants that violate Torah. Those, maybe you want to make some money, but if it involves oppressing your brother, you don't do it. So, and I'm just going to read here. Yahweh's command for Israel to circumcise the foreskin of her heart was a spiritual command. The physical manifestation of performing spiritual circumcision was a person's obedience to Yahweh's physical law. He didn't desire faint obedience, but he wanted a willing and joyful heart. As Moses states in Deuteronomy 28, verses 47 through 48. It's a willing heart, a willing spirit. And we see that spiritual and physical precepts walk hand in hand in the law. Yahweh did not consider Israel to have spiritual faith until her trust, like Abraham's, manifested itself through physical obedience, naturally displaying confidence in the Creator's bread of life. So again, we have the idea that physical is manifested in the spiritual, but the spiritual is always manifested in the physical. So if a person wants to have a spiritual relationship with God, they want something that is more than just do's and don'ts, you can't have it unless you have the physical first. That is the first step, developing what perhaps I grew up knowing as holy, righteous character. That concept is a Torah concept because you are to weed out, you are to circumcise and cut away those things that are desires or attitudes within you that are not in harmony with the teaching of Yahweh's law. Turn with me to Leviticus 25:17. This continues this concept where it says, "You shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear Yahweh your God, for I am Yahweh." The idea of fearing God that is not something, it may manifest in a physical action, but it is not something that is an innate physical action. It is something that is spiritual. It is something that is a philosophy. It is a way of life. Again, 1 Samuel 12:24, only fear Yahweh and serve him with all your heart, for consider how great things he has done for you. But if you shall still do wickedly, you shall be consumed, both you and your king. So there's this idea that the fear of God is what enables us to develop this spiritual attribute of having the right attitude, of serving Jehovah wholeheartedly with all our heart, mind, and soul. It begins with fearing him. And why? We find the answer to the why in Exodus 34, verse 7. You know, when Moses asked Jehovah to reveal himself to him, he says, I want to know you. I mean, Moses is crying out for a relationship with God. He says, I want to know you. I want to see you. I want to know who you are. God promises, I will pass before you and I will proclaim who I am. That's what he tells Moses. And Yahweh could have picked anything to proclaim who he was. But one of the things that he states, he says, I am a righteous God, but he says, I will not hold the guiltless free of his iniquity. But rather, he says, it will be rendered often, it comes to fruition in the third and fourth rebellious generations of those that hate me. So you find this idea that Jehovah will not clear the guilty. The fact that he holds us accountable. And oftentimes, like King David, we may not have the direct consequence of our sin, but it's laid up in ways that our children learn and things that they see us do. Those are laid up as an inheritance for our children to inherit. We talk all the time about alcoholism and how that tendency tends to be passed down father to child. And children of alcoholics tend to have a greater disposition for developing a craving for the substance. The same thing with other desires and other sins that we may lay up that is passed down. You know, oftentimes smokers, the children of smokers are that grew up in that household are far more likely to develop that habit than if you grew up in a family where it just was not acceptable. Again, it comes back to what are you establishing? What type of inheritance and heritage are you establishing for your children? So we find that the fear of Yahweh comes by knowing that he's not going to hold you guiltless. At some point in time, as Thomas Jefferson once said, that he feared the righteousness of Yahweh because his justice does not sleep forever. Eventually, those consequences, they're natural law, and they are going to come home to roost whether you acknowledge it or not. They are just simple natural consequences that come from the way that you live your life. The eternal and unchanging truths in Yahweh's law are consistently applied in the physical world. His physical commands are hinged on spiritual beliefs that would naturally manifest themselves into physical actions when his people wholeheartedly feared their God. The precept of the law taught the people how to attain physical and spiritual peace. You know, in Psalms 119, verses 165, David talks about having this inner peace with God, this spiritual place that he had because of his relationship with God and because he obeyed the law and he knew the law. You also find that let's look at Psalms 19, verse 7, where David says that the fear of Yahweh is clean, it endures forever, and the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of understanding, and a good understanding have all those that do the commandments. So to have this good understanding, you have to do the commandments to gain the spiritual understanding. It's not, you know, our modern world really wants to reverse this. We want to have the spiritual side first and then say that, well, the obedience will come later. That's not what you find in Torah. You find that the obedience comes first, and then through the obedience, you begin to learn those spiritual truths. I would say in the same vein, you know, if you are going to school to become a doctor, you know, you're educated in the way, you study the way, but there are things that you have to do along the way that put your training into action so that you know what you are doing. You also find that this idea of the fear of Jehovah in Psalms 19, verse 9, that it endures forever. This fear of Jehovah does not pass at Israel's restoration. And in fact, we find that the fear of Jehovah is actually key to the latter-day restoration of Israel, to us becoming a people united again in his sight. It is this fear of Jehovah that really knits us together. We find that I'm going to skip down. I'm still on page 292 if you guys are following along. I'm going to jump down to about 3/4 of the page. It says, fearing Jehovah David's fearing of Jehovah caused him to trust and believe that that Yahweh's law was good for him, and that the fear of Yahweh enabled David to receive Yahweh's spirit. And next week, when we continue this study, we're going to see that David actually had Jehovah's spirit. You know, some people may think of this as a purely Christian concept. I'm going to challenge you on this, because this idea of Yahweh's Holy Spirit being something that leads you and guides you is something that is a Torah concept. It is a Tanakh concept. And we're going to see that in great detail next week, or actually in 2 weeks, because next week is a bye week. But David's ability to receive Jehovah's spirit came first by obeying the law, secondly by studying the law, and it gave him the ability to accurately discern Yahweh's spiritual, physical, and prophetic law. David was able to see into the future because many of his psalms are very prophetic. He foresaw Israel hanging their harps on Babylon's willow trees. He foresaw the diaspora. He foresaw a future restoration. He foresaw a lot of things in Israel's future because he looked to the past. He looked to Israel's history, and he looked to the Torah. And Jeremiah is really the prophet that brings home the trait of the fear of Jehovah as the quality, the defining spiritual characteristics that will sanctify the nation in the fear of Yahweh, and that will unite our hearts to come back to Jehovah. So look at Jeremiah 32, and we're going to look at verses 37 through 40. This is what Jeremiah says. He says, behold, I will gather them out of all countries where I have driven them in my anger and in my fury and in my great wrath. And I will bring them again to this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And I will give them one heart and one way. Again, this one way, this is talking about constitution, this one way, this direct, as it was in ancient Israel's day. It is a revitalized constitution that he will give to us, a way of life, that they may fear me forever, and for the good of them and their children after them, that I will make an everlasting covenant with them, and I will not turn away from them to do their good. But here's the key. I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me. So what is it that prevents us from departing from God, both physically and spiritually? It is this fear of Jehovah. It is this fear of Jehovah that is able to restore, that is able to endow us with sanity in our religion, that gives us sanity to know that if we steal, there is accountability, that we have to pay retribution, that if we defraud, we have to pay retribution. Not that we can't be restored. You can always be restored, but it still has to be followed. And to our leaders, that God will not hold the guilt and the culpability of our leaders. You know, today, you look at the leaders of society, they scoff at any accountability. They think they can break laws right, left, and center, and that they are above the law, that the law does not apply to them, and that they can manipulate it. There's loopholes. They can use everything for their own advantage. Torah speaks against that, and Jehovah holds those leaders accountable, but he does that through the people. He does that through the government that he set up, the constitution that he has established, that establishes liberty on the land. So they all work hand in hand. I'm just going to read from this because again, I can't express this better myself than I think the way it's written. The fear of YHWH is the quality that sanctifies latter-day Israel. Walking in this fear alone will cause his people to never again depart from YHWH or his way of life. Once again, we see that Yahweh desires people to serve and worship him with their whole heart and not feign physical compliance, but genuine belief that Yahweh will hold them accountable for their sins. They must fear the righteousness of their God, knowing that consequences always lie ahead. So we also find in Torah, and I don't have on my notes, I think it says, we're going to look at this in 2 weeks when we come back to this, is the idea that if you bring under the law, if you simply bring your sin offering, say you've sinned and you just bring it, but you don't bring it with the right heart, the right attitude, the right spirit, God really doesn't care. He doesn't want your feigned obedience. He wants you to bring your offering as something that is personal to you, something where it costs you something and it hurts you. It doesn't hurt you just because it's an economic penalty. It hurts you because you know you have done wrong, and that it hurts you in your conscience, it hurts you in your character and your spirit, so that you will teshuvah, you will turn from your ways, and you will seek a better path that returns you to a covenant and a relationship with him. So this is where we're going to conclude tonight's class. I'm just going to give you guys a teaser. Next week is a bye week. We will be taking off next week, which is, I believe, February. Let me look at this. It's going to be February 12th. We will be skipping February 12th, but then we'll be meeting again on the 19th. I know this is kind of an awkward place to skip, but and I may actually, let me confirm that date, because I did receive word tonight that Hanok is going to be in town, and I'm going to verify that. So if there's a conflict, we may switch the 12th with the 19th, and that may work out better all the way around so that we can complete this chapter, because that's kind of a bad place to leave right in the middle of the spiritual and physical law conversation. The next topic that we will be discussing in this discussion is the idea that sin begins in the heart. This is a Torah concept. We're also going to be looking at the role covetousness plays in the law. The only thing that within Israel's constitutional framework, God forbids covetousness. This is not something that is physical. This is something that is spiritual. It's within your heart, within your soul. It's an attitude. It is a desire. So we're going to look at how that plays into Israel's law. We're also going to see the difference between a Torah approach to sin in the heart and perhaps more modern theology's approach to sin in the heart and how God deals with that. We're also going to see what the Torah's idea of true sacrifice is, and then we're going to look at Yahweh's willing spirit. And I think that when we come to the idea of Yahweh's spirit being active in ancient Israel, being active in their lives, and being freely accessible to all of Israel's citizens, I think there might be some concepts that maybe we have to re-examine at the end of the day and go, wow, Israel's accusations against Yahweh and his law, and many of the modern accusations, are quite unfounded. So that's where we're going to leave tonight. I am going to go up now and catch some of these great comments. So, glad to see you made it, Keith. Great to have you with us. And Keith says, Romans 7:14, for we know that Torah is spiritual. Great quote. That is a great point, Keith. I'm glad you posted that. Fred Roberts says, very powerful in Job. Yeah, you know, Job is very powerful. And as I get closer to releasing volume 2, because I'm not going to do this prematurely, because there's some new theories that are presented there that you really don't find in anything that's written up to date. And I don't want to let the cat out of the bag first. But you find that the contrast between Eliphaz and his 3 friends and Job and Elihu is striking. It's just absolutely striking, the contrast of theology that is in those ideas. So, but I'm going to leave that hanging because there are more spiritual truths to be gleaned there, not just spiritual, but understanding that I believe really totally brings us back. When you understand Job, you totally come back to fearing Jehovah in every way and seeing that he is truly righteous in all of his judgments. So I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not going to go too deep into that. And then Cindy posts Ezekiel 20, 12 through 22. Okay. Oh, I don't have my Bible program open. I should have, I had to shut down earlier today. I'm going to post that on my wall later, because I want everyone to know what that is. If you guys want to post that, that would be great. And oh, thank you so much, Stephen. He says, this is a much needed chapter. Just spreading this chapter alone would do so much to dispel many false foundations. Maybe you should make it a pamphlet or a sample chapter of your website. That's a great idea, and I may do that. You know, I could even turn it into perhaps a blog post or something at some point in time. Just put it out there. And then we talked about the Hebrew word for neighbor is ra'ah, which means to pasture in the same flock by the same shepherd, which is just the analogy embodied in that word is just fascinating. All right. Well, any other questions or comments? You know, I think this teaching does provoke some more questions, perhaps, that might be a little more out there than what some more that can be nailed down, because this is more of a spiritual issue. So, oh, thank you so much, Cindy. All right. Well, okay. Oh, you're going to post Ezekiel. Thank you so much. Yes, I did close down my Bible program earlier, or I was gone for part of the day, so maybe somebody closed it down for me, and it does take a good 3-4 minutes to load. So if you could post that, I think we would all appreciate that. And I do look forward to this continued discussion, because when I first started studying this, I really believe there was just one category of sin according to the Old Testament law. And as I studied it, I discovered that there's not just one idea of sin in the eyes of Jehovah. And we're going to look at the different categories of sin next week and what that means as far as approaching it. So I'm going to challenge you. If you or you know somebody who approaches Torah as, you know, 613 commands, and if it isn't written in, if it isn't just written in there black and white, you know, that it is okay, or that it may not be included in there, I'm going to challenge some of those ideas next week or the next time that we meet, because just because it's not written in Torah does not always mean that it is okay to do. So we're going to look at, it really comes down to precept. It comes down to philosophy upon which those teachings and those instructions are founded. All right, so Cindy has just posted Ezekiel or Exodus. This is going to be, I'm not sure if this is, I think this is Ezekiel. Okay, so she's posting Exodus 31, 13 through 17, where it says, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, to know that I am Jehovah who sets them apart. Okay, that was Ezekiel 20. I believe it began in 21. Let me go back up here real quick and catch the exact text. It is going to be, let me find here. All right, I'm just going to look here real quick and see if I can find it, scroll through. Okay, that was Ezekiel 20, verses 12 through 20. Yes, the reference was a cross-reference to Exodus. So, and then continuing in Ezekiel, says, but the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my laws, and they rejected my right rulings, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to consume them. but I acted for my name's sake, and not to profane it among the Gentiles, before whose eyes I had brought them out. And I myself also lifted my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, not to bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the splendor of all lands. So we find that this bringing them into the land, that generation did not come into the land. It perished in the wilderness, and God gave that blessing. He reestablished that promise among their children. So you find that the Sabbath, again, was key to the alleviating of oppression, to the ability to understand and to judge rightly in taking that national holiday. And remember, in Numbers, it also commanded that on that day of national holiday, you had a holy convocation among your communities. So you gathered together. I often compare this to the scene, if you guys have ever watched Little House on the Prairie, where everybody in the community came together. For them, it was on Sunday, but they came together as a community, and they were taught together, and they learned together. And it really is instilled unity, solidarity, and relationship within that local community. Okay, Cindy also posted verse 16. Because they rejected my right rulings and did not walk in my laws, and also profaned my Sabbaths, therefore their heart went after idols. And my eye pardoned them from destroying them, and I did not make an end of them in the wilderness. He did not make an end of them, but he still held the guilty among them accountable, because the guilty among them all perished within 40 years, and they did not enter the land. So he was generous to the nation. He extended mercy to their children, but not to that generation that had rebelled. And remember, at this point in time, when we come to the point of rebellion, Israel had rebelled over 10 separate times against YHWH, this constitutional government he was setting up. So there was lots of precedent and lots of history there for God to base his judgment off of. Verse 18 says, and I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk after the laws of your fathers. So this would have been the laws they would have come out of Egypt with, which would have been Canaanite influence, because Israel came out of a Canaanite society living in Egypt, as well as influenced by Egyptian laws. So God says, do not walk in the laws of your fathers, nor observe their rulings, nor defile yourself with their idols. I am YHWH, your Elohim. Walk in my laws, guard my right rulings, and do them. And set apart my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, and for you to know that I am Elohim. Now, throughout Israel's history, you find that Israel's elders, Israel's society wanted to also add a lot of laws and a lot of rules to the Sinai and Deuteronomic code that did not exist. So God is also addressing these traditions that had evolved in Israel's history in this chastisement that Ezekiel speaks. So next week, I will let you know whether or not we will have class. We're either going to have class either on the 12th or the 19th. One of those will be a bye week and give you guys time to catch up. And we're going to continue on. So we have about 12 pages that we're going to continue next time. And I look forward to all of you guys joining us next week. I really enjoy these time together. And I hope that you guys will join us tomorrow at Roots of Faith at 10:30 a.m. And that's right here on YouTube. Just go to rootsoffaith.com. Or, I'm sorry, Roots of Faith at YouTube. Or there's also the Roots of Faith website at rootsoffaith.org. But any other questions? If there's not, we will call it a night. We have gone over quite a bit tonight. There was a lot to cover. And we will see you again either next week or in 2 weeks. So thank you guys so much. And I wish you a wonderful, restful, and warm evening. And I will say Shabbat Shalom.